Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, 2026. Explosive incidents. Whereas the number of people employed in Los Alamos from the valley changed, the job descriptions did not. Particularly for Nuevo Mexicanos, the jobs continued to be menial work and dangerous labor. Many Nuevo Mexicanos chose not to discuss their jobs or the discrimination that they experienced as workers in Los Alamos, and others were killed before they had the chance. Between 1956 and 1959, 7 men were killed during 3 separate explosive accidents at the lab, including 6 Nuevo Mexicanos. These incidents are the ultimate expression of nuclear alienation. On June 26, 1956, Candelario A. Esquivel was killed as he scraped dried explosive powder into glass bottles. Esquivel, 29, had finished scraping the explosive powder out of 4 of 7 trays when 50 pounds of explosive powder detonated. Images of the worksite after the blast reveal blackened streaks on nearby walls where the rubber stoppers exploded under great force. One of the missions of LASL's group GMX-2 was to conduct research and develop new and modified explosives materials with potential applications in nuclear weapons. Los Alamos National Laboratory, 1956. The group had conducted research in 1950 using an explosive material called thallus acide. The group stopped research on that material in 1950 and placed the thallus acide in a magazine cartridge. Later in 1956, they resumed experiments with thallus acide and devised processes to prepare the material for research purposes. Part of this process was the accident reported describes a simple and straightforward. Involved adding a hot sodium azide solution, a zest that could then be used for weapon experiments. A batch was prepared following this method on June 11th and was left to cool until June 19th. When it did not cool fully, it was placed in an oven designed to dry the wet filter cake. When it did not dry entirely, using the recommended oven temperature was increased from 70 degrees Celsius to 100 degrees Celsius. On June 25th, a small sample was removed from each tray and deemed dry enough to proceed. According to the accident report, the explosion occurred in a building designed and used for the drying of explosives. Candelario Esquivel was tasked with removing the material from the oven and transferring it from the trays to brown glass bottles, and storing it in a magazine cartridge for future use. As Candelario was working through this process, a detonation occurred, killing him instant at 10 a.m. His entire body from head to toe was badly burned. The accident report gives details of how his right hand, both hips, and his genitals were mutilated by the explosion. The specific cause of this detonation remains unknown, and no autopsy was performed on the body. The evidence suggests that Candelario was performing his job instructed, and the laboratory is responsible for the only known negligence in this case, which is that the table where Candelario worked was not grounded, and he was not given conductive soled safety shoes to perform his job. That being said, a spark created by static electricity might have ignited the explosion. The lab evades responsibility by stating that the board does not believe that supervision has been negligent by permitting a hazardous procedure to be used. Changes in procedure for future handling of this material are clearly indicated, but there is certainly no justification for disciplinary action. Thus, Candelario Esquivel becomes the first guinea pig sacrificed for the development of safety procedures for working with high explosives and nuclear materials in the lab. Notably, the accident report discusses the cost of damages to laboratory property, including the oven, a Chevrolet panel truck, and other equipment, for an estimated cost of $10,400. Much detail is given about the conditions of the truck both before and after the incident, and how much its value changed from $300 before the incident to $50 after the incident, clarifying the net damage of the truck at $250. Yet no discussion in the report attends to the loss of life for Calendario and on his family. In fact, no information about Candelario's personal life is given in the accident report at all. The second notable incident occurred on February 24th, 1959, when Leo Guerin, 36, and Raymond Means, 31, were killed. Leo was a machine operator who had just 3 years of experience at S-Site. 2 of those years were spent machining high explosives. According to the accident report, he had a good safety and work record and had received safety training, which included a special demonstration for the nature and consequences of explosions. Ray was classified as a laboratory toolmaker with 6.5 years of experience. Machining explosives at S-Site. He was Leo's immediate supervisor. The explosion occurred as Leo drilled a small hole through plastic explosives using a drill fashioned with a hypodermic needle. Whether the drill overheated or something else caused the blast to be unknown. The recommendations made by the Board of Inquiry in the accident report on February 24th, 1959, S-Site incident specifically state that no more drilling of a small diameter holes, less than 1/4, should be conducted by humans. That only remote controlled processes should be conducted. Leo Guerin and Ray Means' full names are not even disclosed in the report. Instead, they are abbreviated to the initials of their first and middle names and given as L.G. Guerin and R.A. Means. Unlike the 1956 explosion report, this report does not give details on the state of their bodies, but summaries describing the damage to the property, including an extensive set of photographs, are included in the report. This approach further alienates the men from their work, reducing their deaths to mechanical processes that helped influence changes to explosives experiments protocol. The third of the three incidents pertinent to my examination of nuclear alienation occurred on October 14th, 1959, when Jose Corsinio Cordova, 37, Sevedo Lujan, 53, and Escolastico Martinez, 47, and Leopoldo Pacheco, 50, were killed as they prepared a burn site to eliminate scraps of explosives materials. The men were classified as SCPs, the graded job series used by laboratory for technician and operation personnel. Los Alamos National Laboratory. Corsinio, Sevillo, and Escolastico were classified as explosive plant laborers, the lowest grade used for GMX-3 plant employees. Leopoldo was classified as SCP-6, a labor foreman, which is also the lower level of classifications for GMX-3 plant employees. What differentiates the accident report of this incident from the first two is the details pertaining to the men's personal lives. The report suggests that the men misunderstood the directions they were given by the burning ground supervisor because they were predominantly Spanish-speaking Nuevo Mexicanos. It states that they were hired from the local labor pool market of the northern Rio Grande Valley, which is a significant source of technician and operator personnel of all levels. And the list of their previous job experience collectively as having been farmers, painters, truck drivers, service station attendants, laborers, and janitors. It also notes that Corsinio was the only of the men who have completed active duty military service, 16 months in the Army Infantry. The report goes as far as listing their education values. Corsinio, 8th grade, Sevido, 3rd grade, Escolastico, 8th grade, and Leopoldo, 8th grade. Although the report describes the men as literate, it specifically states that, relative to written procedures, it is pertinent to look into the educational background of these men. The problems noted are their Spanish dominant language and literacy skills. The report states, there is considerable evidence that some of the men had some difficulty in fully comprehending English, and it was not uncommon for the burning ground supervisor to convey his instructions to the foreman in English, and in turn the foreman to instruct members of the crew in Spanish. This shifts the blame from the white laboratory personnel to the Nuevo Mexicano foreman, in this case Leopoldo Pacheco. Additionally, when describing the orientation, indoctrination, and training sequence that all members of this crew must undergo, it is stated that the foreman acts as a translator at any occasion where the language barrier may prevent thorough understanding and comprehension. By questioning not only their ability to comprehend instructions in English, but also their ability to comprehend instructions, period, the report insinuates that the men were incapable of following directions, which might have caused their deaths. The extent to which the report describes the men's English proficiency and formal education in comparison with the comprehensive training they received precipitates the report's hypothesis that the men were responsible for their own deaths. It insinuates that they were too naive and unintelligent to follow protocol. The accident report suggests that they deviated from standard operating procedures, but also that none of these deviations caused the explosion. 16 deviations are initially listed as being unrelated to the explosion, probably would not have affected whether or not it occurred. Another 5 deviations listed could have affected the explosion, including how the men handled the scrap explosives before withdrawing it from the delivery truck. Despite listing all of these deviations, 21 from standard operating procedures, none of the deviations explain the explosion, but rather collectively suggest that the men are to blame for their own demise. The ethics of clinical research in the Third World. An essential ethical condition for a randomized clinical trial comparing 2 treatments for a disease is that there be no good reason for thinking one is better than the other. Usually, investigators hope and even expect that the new treatment will be better, but there should not be solid evidence one way or the other. If there is, not only would the retrial be scientifically redundant, but the investigators would be guilty of knowingly giving inferior treatment to some participants of the trial. The necessity for investigators to be in this state of equipoise applies to placebo-controlled trials. As well, only when there is no known effective treatment. Is it ethical to compare a potential new treatment with a placebo? When effective treatment exists, a placebo may not be used. Instead, subjects in the control group of the study must receive the best known treatment. Investigators are responsible for all subjects enrolled in a trial, not just some of them. And the goals of the research are always secondary to the well-being of the participants. Those requirements are made clear in the Declaration of Helsinki of the World Organization, WHO, which is widely regulated as the providing the fundamental guiding principles of research. Involving human subjects. It states, in research on man, the interests of science and society should never take precedence over considerations related to the well-being of the subject. And in any medical study, every patient, including those of the control group, if any, should be assured of the best proven diagnostic and therapeutic method. One reason ethical code are unequivocal about investigators' primary obligation to care for the human subjects of their research is the strong temptation to subordinate the subjects' welfare to the objectives of the study. That is particularly likely when the research question is extremely important and the answer would probably improve the care of future patients substantially in those circumstances. It is sometimes argued explicitly that obtaining a rapid, unambiguous answer to the research question is the primary ethical obligation. With the most altruistic of motives, then researchers may find themselves slipping across a line that prohibits treating human subjects to as means to an end. When that line is crossed, there is very little left to protect patients from a callous disregard of their welfare for the sake of research goals. Even informed consent, because of the asymmetry in knowledge and authority, between researchers and their subjects, and approval by an institutional review board, though also important, is highly variable in its responsiveness to patients' interests when they conflict with the interests of researchers. A textbook example of an unethical research, a textbook example of the unethical research is the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis. In that study, which was sponsored by the U.S. Public Health Service and lasted from 1932 to 1972, 412 poor African American men with untreated syphilis were followed and compared with 204 men free of the disease to determine the natural history of syphilis. Although there was no very good treatment available at the time the study began, heavy metals were the standard treatment. The research continued even after penicillin became widely available and was also known for being highly effective against syphilis. The study was not terminated until it came to the attention of a reporter, and the outrage provoked by front-page stories in the Washington Star and New York Times embarrassed the Nixon administration, calling the halt to it. The ethical violations were multiple. Subjects did not provide informed consent. Indeed, they were deliberately deceived. They were denied the best-known treatment. And the study was continued even after highly effective treatment became available. And what were the arguments in favor of the Tuskegee study? That these poor African American men probably would not have been treated anyway, so the investigators were merely observing what would have happened if there had been no study. And that the study was important, a never-to-be-repeated opportunity, said one physician after penicillin became available. Ethical concern was even stood on its head when it was suggested that only was the information valuable, but it was especially so for people like the subjects, an impoverished rural population with a very high rate of untreated syphilis. The only lament seemed to be that many of the subjects inadvertently received treatment by other doctors. Some of these issues were raised by Lurie and Wolfe elsewhere in this issue of the journal. They discuss the ethics of ongoing trials in the third world of regimens to prevent the vertical transmission of human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. Infection. All except one of the trials employed placebo-treated control groups, despite the fact that zidovudine has already been clearly shown to cut the rate of vertical transmission greatly and is now recommended to the United States for all HIV-infected pregnant women. The justifications are reminiscent of those of the Tuskegee study. Women in the third world would not receive antiretroviral treatment anyway. So the investigators were simply observing what would happen to the subject's infants if there were no study. And placebo-controlled study is the fastest, most efficient way to obtain unambiguous information that will be the greatest value in the third world. Thus, in response to protests from Wolfe and others in the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the directors of the National Institute of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the organization sponsoring the studies, argued it is an unfortunate fact that the current standard of perinatal care for the HIV-infected pregnant women in the sites of the studies does not include any HIV prophylactic intervention at all. and the inclusion of placebo controls will result in the most rapid, accurate, and reliable answer to the question of the value of the intervention of being studied compared to the local standard of care. As mentioned earlier, the Declaration of Helsinki requires a control group to receive the best current treatment, not the local one. The shift is wording between best and local may be slight. But the implications are profound. Acceptance of this ethical relativism would result in widespread exploitation of vulnerable third world populations for research programs that could not be carried out in the sponsoring country. Furthermore, it directly contradicts the Department of Health and Human Services' own regulation governing U.S. sponsored research in foreign countries, as well as joint guidelines for research in the third world, issued by WHO and the Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences, which require that human subjects receive protection of at least equivalent to that in the sponsoring country. There appears to be a general retreat from the clear principles enunciated Furthermore, it directly contradicts the Department of Health and Human Services' own regulations governing U.S. sponsored research in foreign countries, as issued by the WHO and Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, which require that human subjects receive at least equivalent to that in the sponsoring country. There appears to be general retreat from the clear principles enunciated in the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki as applied to research in the third world. Why is that? Is it because the local standard of care is different? I don't think so. In my view, that is merely a self-serving justification after the fact. Is it because diseases and their treatments are very different in the third world, so that information gained in the industrialized world has no relevance and we have to start from scratch? That too seems an unlikely explanation, although here again it often offered as justification. Sometimes there may be relevant differences between populations, but that cannot be as assumed, unless there are specific indications to the contrary. The safest and most reasonable position is that people everywhere are likely to respond similarly to the same treatment. I think we have to look elsewhere for the real reasons. One of them may be slavish adherence to the tenets of clinical trials. According to these, all trials should be randomized, double-blind, and placebo-controlled, if at all possible. The rigidity may explain the NIH's pressure on Mark Lallement to include a placebo group in his study, as described by Lurie and Wolf. Sometimes journals are blamed for the problem because they are thought to demand strict conformity to the standard methods. That is not true, at least not at this journal. We do not want a scientifically neat study if it is ethically flawed, but like Lurie and Wolf, we believe that in many cases it is possible, with little ingenuity, to have both scientific and ethical rigor. The retreat from ethical principles may also be explained by some of the exigencies doing clinical research in the increasingly regulated and competitive environment. Research in the third world looks relatively attractive as it becomes better funded and regulations at home become more restrictive. Despite the existence of codes requiring that human subjects receive at least the same protection abroad as at home, they are still honored partly in the breach. The fact remains that many studies are done in the third world that simply could not be done in the country sponsoring the work. Clinical trials have become a big business, with many of the same imperatives to survive. It is necessary to get the work done as quickly as possible with minimum obstacles. When the considerations prevail, as it seems as if we have not come very far from Tuskegee after all. Those of us in the research community need to redouble our commitment to the highest ethical standards, no matter where the research is conducted, and sponsoring agencies need to enforce those standards, not undercut them.